Good afternoon. My name is John Lindahl. I'd like to welcome you to the Nebraska State Historical Society's Brown Bag Lecture Series held here at the Nebraska History Museum, the third Thursday of every month. A detailed schedule for this series, as well as information about all the Historical Society's programs and services, can be found on our website at nebraskahistory.org. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to thank the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation for funding the filming of these lectures. Their financial support allows us to tape and broadcast these programs on public access television. Our speaker today is Sheryl Schmeckpeper of Norfolk, who's been the editor of the Living section of the Norfolk Daily News for 13 years. She's a history enthusiast, and she's written numerous articles about Nebraska history for Nebraska Life magazine. She is also the author of Images of Nebraska Norfolk, which was published in 2000. Sheryl is past president of the Elkhorn Valley Historical Society in Norfolk and is a first-year member of the Nebraska State Historical Society's Board of Trustees. The title of her topic today is From the Colonel to Carson, the People Who Put Norfolk on the Map. Please welcome Sheryl Schmeckpeper.
Thank you for having me this noon. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to read just a little bit of an introduction before we start looking at some pictures. To tell the history of any place in the world, one must tell the story of its people. So to tell Norfolk's story, I have to tell you about the Germans, Irish, Swedes, Poles, and Czechs who immigrated here from Europe and carved a civilization out of the treeless Nebraska prairie. I suspect that when first arriving, they felt a little like Jim Burden did when, after having been raised in Virginia, he was introduced to the prairie. The character in Willa Cather's My Antonia said, "There was nothing to see, no fences, no creeks, no hills or fields. If there was a road, I could not make it out in the faint starlight. There was nothing but land, not a country at all, but the material out of which countries are made." Still, despite the desolation, settlers came, by foot, by wagon, on horseback, and eventually by train. They carried their dreams of creating a sustainable, independent life, free from tyranny and oppression, drawn by the promise of free land that was considered by some to be nothing more than a barren desert. Most of them stayed in spite of the droughts that killed their livestock, the grasshoppers that not only devoured their crops but also chewed through their shoe leather and horse harnesses. They stayed in spite of the scorching heat, unpredictable tornadoes, and vicious prairie fires. They stayed in spite of the blizzards that buried their houses, barns, and sometimes even their livestock and loved ones. And they stayed in spite of the diseases that took their children. In fact, between 1854 and 1889, around 1 million immigrants settled here and transformed this land into one of the most important agricultural states in the Union. But the immigrants were not the first people to inhabit this area of the Great Plains. Long before the wagons rolled through the Big and Little Bluestem, the switchgrass and buffalo grass, this area was home to the Ponca, Pawnee, and Sioux Indians who lived in earth lodges, hunted their buffalo, prayed to a god called Wakanda, and referred to the earth as their mother. They were Indians such as Standing Bear, the Ponca leader who in 1879 won the landmark court victory that determined that Indians were, in fact, persons under the law. By the time Standing Bear won his battle in the courtroom, most of the Indians in the area had been moved to reservations in the South, leaving Nebraska open to settlers such as John and Maria Detterman, who were among the first immigrants to move into what would eventually become Madison County. John and Maria Detterman, who are in this photograph right here, were among the first immigrants to come to Norfolk. Actually, Norfolk was settled by a group of German immigrants who originally went to Wisconsin and didn't necessarily like it up there because the land was difficult for farming and it was also fairly expensive. So they, in 1866, they sent a scout basically down to the Norfolk area or to Nebraska, that northeast Nebraska, to scout it out. He went back with a nice report saying it's good land, it's open land, it can be taken, and so they, the following spring, 125 of them left Wisconsin and settled in what is northeast Nebraska, in what is in the area where Norfolk is now. And John and Marie Detterman, who are photographed here, were among those first settlers. And they are important because they built one of the first cabins in Norfolk, in what is now Norfolk. And that cabin, remnants of that cabin still stands. Today, for years it was in Johnson's Park. It had a fence around it because through the years it had been vandalized from time to time. And it was owned by the city for many years, and every now and then the city would go in and repair what they needed to repair on it. And about 7 or 8 years ago, the city of Norfolk gave the cabin to the Elkhorn Valley, or sold the cabin to the Elkhorn Valley Historical Society. It was moved to Burgess Park, which is where the Elkhorn Valley Museum sits, and it was restored. The man who did the restoration work took great pains to rebuild it and make it as historically accurate as possible. The reality is that there's probably very little of that original cabin that still is in there. There's very little original wood. But we like having it because it really is a symbol of the spirit of the pioneers who came from Wisconsin and who settled Norfolk. And for that, we're grateful to John and Maria Detterman. Personally, I think they look really pretty happy to be in Norfolk myself. They look like they're just thrilled to be there. But when the first settlers arrived, as you know, grass and water for livestock was plentiful, but the settlers had to travel to West Point, Columbus, and even Fremont to have their wheat ground into flour or to buy sugar, coffee, and other supplies. They sheared their own sheep, and the women carded their wool, spun their own yarn, and wove fabric on hand looms. One of the men in the settlement, a cobbler, made their shoes from wood using bits of leather for the strings. For fun, they danced in the schoolhouse, skated on the river, and on Sunday went visiting. In time, more settlers came, including Civil War veterans, former slaves, out-of-work fur trappers, and buffalo hunters. And one of those veterans was Colonel Charles Mathewson, who is in this photograph, served in the military during the Civil War, eventually ended up on the Omaha and Winnebago Indian reservations. And when he retired, he happened to visit Norfolk, was to become Norfolk, was impressed with the thrifty, hardworking Germans there, and decided that he would build a mill. So he brought in some workers, and with help from two of his sons, he built the mill in Norfolk on a spot on the North Fork of a branch of the North Fork of the Elkhorn River. And that site really determined where Norfolk was going to be built because the town sprang up around that mill. So construction began in the spring of 1869. Materials were hauled by rail to Columbus and on to Norfolk by wagon. They brought in oak wood from Yellow Banks, which is a spot on the Elkhorn River west of Norfolk. And like I said, once the mill was finished, he built a general store, which also served as the first post office. A man by the name of August Roche was Norfolk's first postmaster. And just by chance, I happened to talk to his great-grandson the other day. I always work at the Daily News, and he stopped in, and I recognized that his name was Roche and talked to him a little bit. And he's August Roche's great-grandson, and he told me that August was also a Civil War veteran who lived with a wound from that Civil War for 50 years. He was wounded in the war, evidently never healed, and he lived with that wound for 50 years. There are still Dettermans around, there are still Roches around, so the family members have stayed in the area. In 1885, the colonel sold his interest in the mill to the partnership of Burchard and Bridge, and it eventually became Norfolk Feed Mills. Remained on that site until the 1980s when it was moved to Omaha Avenue. And today the site has a discount store and an office building. By 1870, Norfolk had a second general store, a shoe shop, a blacksmith shop, cabinet and casket maker. Also that year, Frederick Wagner opened a boarding house and saloon. August Pilger opened a hardware store. In 1871, John Kenningstein opened a drugstore. And a year later, August Pilger and Herman Jerick opened a lumberyard and furniture store. And Herman Jerick, who's the gentleman in the center there, his family arrived in America in 1854 with the intentions of settling in Iowa. Their journey across the country took them up to Quebec, down to Detroit, and on to Chicago, where a couple of agents sold them tickets to Milwaukee instead of Iowa. They ended up in Milwaukee and were tired of traveling, so decided to stay there. And young Herman joined the military, served in the Civil War. When the war was over, went back to Wisconsin for a while, decided he didn't really like it up there, so he followed a group of immigrants that were going on to Norfolk and arrived in Norfolk. Still wasn't happy with his situation in life, re-enlisted in the military, served under Buffalo Bill Cody, eventually served under the Colonel Mathewson, which is how he ended up back in Norfolk. I should back up a little bit. He followed immigrants to Nebraska after his first stint in the service. Followed immigrants to Nebraska, and that's when, not necessarily in the Norfolk area. But once he arrived in Norfolk, he worked for the Colonel, helped him build the mill, and in 1881, he presented a petition to the county board to recognize Norfolk as a village, and 5 years later, he was elected Norfolk's first mayor. And he built a house at 1202 Norfolk Avenue, which actually is still standing. And Herman started a trend because he was the first of 8 Norfolk mayors who were Civil War veterans. In addition to wanting houses and mills and stores, those first settlers also wanted churches and schools. Norfolk's first church and school were St. Paul's Lutheran, established in 1867 by John Heckendorf, who immigrated to Nebraska with the contingent from Wisconsin. Not surprisingly, that first church was a log cabin. 10 years later, the congregation built a wood frame church, and currently they have a brick church, which was dedicated in 1908. Several years after the Heckendorfs arrived, a Reverend Kidder and his family came to town, and Mrs. Kidder taught in what would have been Norfolk's first public school, using books from Colonel Mathewson's library. In 1891, Norfolk High School was built on the corner of 6th Street and Phillip Avenue, and although only 2 teachers worked at the school when it opened, the building could accommodate 500 people. Fire destroyed that building in 1907, but it was rebuilt to the exact specifications. And in 1922, a new high school was built between 4th and 5th Streets on Paswalk Avenue, which actually still stands and is today used as our junior high school. As in most places during those early years, travel to and from Norfolk was done by stagecoach or wagon. Goods and mail could come as far as Columbus by train and had to be transported by wagon. That transportation dilemma really kind of kept Norfolk from growing, and it was solved in September of 1879 when the first train rolled into town. Eventually, the Norfolk would have 3 trains coming into 3 different depots. This photo is of the Fremont-Elkhorn Missouri Valley Railroad, which built a depot on the south side of Norfolk at what is called now Norfolk Junction. And actually, there is a depot still there. And I think the reason they didn't come into downtown Norfolk is some kind of a dispute with city fathers over land or that type of thing. By 1880, the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad built a depot at 7th Street between Madison and Phillip Avenue, and that same year, the Omaha, Niobrara, and Black Hills branch of the Union Pacific opened a depot at 5th and Brosh Avenue. So by 1880, there was a lot of train traffic going in and out of Norfolk. And with the trains came the people who were settling the area, who were hungry for news and entertainment and a civilized life. Norfolk's first newspaper was published in 1872, just 6 years after the first settlers arrived. For 2 dozen eggs or 1 mink, settlers could receive the Pioneer for 3 months. For 3 bushels of wheat or a half quart of wood, they could get the paper for a year. I wonder if Jerry Hughes would allow those subscription rates now. I don't know. The Norfolk Daily News began publication in 1877 and was purchased by William Hughes and his son W.N. Hughes in 1888. When W.N. died in 1913, his sons Norris and Gene Hughes took over operation of the newspaper. Gene Hughes eventually bought his brother's interest and expanded the company's holdings to include radio station WJG, for which he also built the first transmitter. That station went on the air in the summer of 1922, and station still has the WJAG call letters and is still is licensed to be on the air from sunup to sundown. The Norfolk Daily News was housed in this building on North 4th Street from 1894 to 1964, when it moved to its current location on Norfolk Avenue. Today, Jerry Hughes, who would be William's great-grandson, is the publisher. So the newspaper has stayed in the family all of those years. It's probably one of the few newspapers, I don't know exactly what the number is, but there aren't very many family, privately owned newspapers in the country anymore. So it's pretty rare. And I needed to include the Hughes family, the Hughes publishing family, because they've been very active in civic life in Norfolk, as far as supporting and promoting, cultural organizations in the community, political life. They've been very instrumental in civic life in Norfolk, Nebraska. I'm not going to take you on a step-by-step, year-by-year account of Norfolk's growth, but I do want to talk about some of the other people who were influential in making Norfolk what it is today. And one of them was John Stein. And you can, to me, when you go into a city, you can always tell who the movers and shakers, early movers and shakers were, because they always have streets named for them. And of course, we have Stein Avenue. We have there's a Dreek Street. There's Paswalk Avenue, and Paswalk was one of the first families that moved to the first families to settle the area. John Stein became one of Norfolk's first village trustees in 1881, developed much of downtown Norfolk, including building the Pacific Hotel, which was located on the corner of 5th Street and Norfolk Avenue. 40 years later, his son Jack built the Granada Theater, which became really one of Norfolk's early cultural landmarks. When I was growing up, in junior high age, the Granada Theater was the place to go to watch movies on Friday night. By then it was starting to show a lot of wear and tear, but you could tell that during its heyday it was a very fine, ornate, fancy theater, probably a little mini version of what the Orpheum in Omaha or Sioux City would have been at the time. So I believe that Johnny Carson worked there when he was in high school, worked as an usher there when he was in high school. So it really was like I said, a cultural landmark for Norfolk. Unfortunately, it was allowed to fall into disrepair, and in the early 80s, I think it was torn down. But luckily, the representatives from the Historical Society were able to salvage some of that front facade that you see, and some of the backdrops and things from the stage. And those are on display at the Elkhorn Valley Museum right now. And some of the pictures, some of the black and white pictures that were on display in the gallery, we were able to save those, and so those are on exhibit at the Elkhorn Valley Museum. So we managed to save a little bit of the old Granada Theater. And the spot where it stood is now a parking lot. I doubt that Andy Risser's name is ever mentioned in the same breath as the Wright brothers, but Andy had as much impact on aviation in Norfolk as the Wright brothers had on aviation as a whole. Andy opened Norfolk's flying school in 1928, and that same year, 37 students took their first solo flights. The original airport, with 2 hangars, an office building, and a windsock, was southeast of Norfolk. And in 1934, Andy moved his operations to 160 acres of land south of Norfolk on Highway 81, which is where Norfolk's airport is still located. When the winds of war started blowing in Europe, the airport Andy built became the site of the civilian pilot training program, where students learned to fly before entering the service. And here, Andy is here shown on the left with Henry Brundholt of Pilger, who was his first student. Andy's name probably would be on the same level as the Savage brothers. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Savage brothers from Ewing, but they really wrote their name in aviation history, and I think Andy Risser did the same thing for aviation in northeast Nebraska. And this is Cora Beals. She is important because many of the photographs that I'm showing to you probably wouldn't be around if not for Cora Beals. She came to Norfolk in 1874 with her parents, married a man by the name of George Beals in 1889, opened a private school, and really became Norfolk's unofficial historian. She made it a point to gather photographs of all the original settlers, and I don't know if Deb can probably... Did we have the Cora Beals collection when you were in Norfolk? Okay. It was property of the library for a long time, and then the Norfolk Public Library gave it to the Elkhorn Valley Historical Society. But hundreds of photographs of life in early Norfolk. So she was one of our first historians, and so we owe her a debt of gratitude. She also was very active in organizing a lot of the women's groups, like the women's clubs and the Nancy Gary chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution and that type of thing. So in addition to being Norfolk's first historian, she was probably also one of Norfolk's first social leaders. So. Another important family in Norfolk history is the Burgess family. Ferdinand Burgess was one of Norfolk's early pioneers, probably came to the area in the 1880s, 1890s. In addition to being a doctor, he was also a farmer, homesteaded and developed property in the area. His son and grandson were also doctors. So his son was C.J., his grandson was Val. C.J. was elected Norfolk's youngest mayor in 1930, and this is C.J. That same year, C.J. bought property north of Norfolk, which is where the Norfolk Brick and Tile Company was located. It's about 3 or 4 blocks north of downtown Norfolk. And he bought the property, and the property at the west end of it was kind of had a hill or a cliff behind it. And C.J. created it. He made a park out of that property. And at one time, I think it had a like a petting zoo or a zoo. It had a pond where because there were photographs of people canoeing on the pond. And then at some point, C.J.'s son Val decided he wanted to dig a cave in the back of the hill. So he started digging and kept digging, and pretty soon C.J. must have figured out that Val wasn't going to quit digging. So he hired engineers to come in and help him. And they dug a cave in the back of the side of this hill behind the park, and engineers came and shored it up. And I think at one time it had a kitchen, kind of a makeshift kitchen. It had several rooms, and in the late 20s, early 30s, it was used for meetings and for dances and for parties and that type of thing. The cave is still there. Today, the Elkhorn Valley Museum sits at the mouth of Burgess Park, because 10 or 15 years ago, the city gave the park to the Historical Society, and that's where they built Elkhorn Valley Museum. So the park, the cave, now belong to the state or the Elkhorn Valley Historical Society. So on occasion, we open the cave for tours and events, and especially at Halloween. It's a great place to make like a spook house for kids. They love it. So. But C.J. also built Burgess Sanitarium, which was a convalescent hospital in Norfolk, which sat right on the other side of Burgess Park, and he had a trolley type of thing that would take patients from the hospital to the park and back and forth. So C.J. died in 1967. His son Val practiced medicine in Norfolk until the 1980s. I suspect a lot of you haven't heard about the Burgess family and Andy Risser, but I suspect most of you have heard about the Hall brothers, who founded Hallmark Cards. They actually got their start in Norfolk, Nebraska, and William Rowley and Joyce Hall were born in David City to a Mr. and Mrs. George Hall. They also had a sister, I believe. Eventually, their father left them. And so the boys at very young ages had to go out and go to work. Rowley was born in 1882, William in 1884, and Joyce in 1891. Eventually, William made his way to Norfolk and owned several businesses, including the Hall Smokehouse, Hall's Gift and Card Shop, and a portion of the Norfolk Postcard Company. And in 1905, he bought the Norfolk Book and Stationery Company. Eventually, the businesses grew enough that he brought his brothers in to work with him. And they were very successful in the postcard business, and this is one of the Hall brothers' postcards. In time, Joyce moved his portion of the business to Kansas City, and the brothers followed. Eventually, the postcard business started to wane, so being the industrious people that they were, they went into the greeting card business. And I don't have to tell you what's happened to the Hall brothers' greeting card business. So, and like I said, this is one of the Hall brothers' postcards, and it's significant for two reasons. Not only is it a Hall brothers postcard, but the house in this picture belonged to Dr. Alexander Baer, who was one of Norfolk's first doctor. When I was involved with the Historical Society, we tried really hard to get some artifacts from the Hall family so we could create an exhibit to remember the Hall brothers. They really feel like the business began in Kansas City. They don't really consider Norfolk home, but we still claim them as ours. Whether they want to belong to us or not, we claim them as ours. So, but I think the museum actually has some postcards that the Hallmark company does not have. Some of those early original postcards we have that they don't have. Because I know a few years ago they were doing some kind of an anniversary booklet, and they contacted the museum and wanted copies of some of our postcards because they didn't have some of them. So Norfolk has several claims to fame. And I don't know how many of you have ever heard of Harry King, but Harry King had an impact on Norfolk also. In 1917, he built King's Ballroom, which for the next 70 years was probably one of the busiest places in Norfolk. I'm guessing this was probably taken in the 1920s or thereabouts, some type of a dance. Popular spot for dances and parties and meetings and anything social or that involved a gathering of people happened at King's Ballroom. During the 40s, some of the biggest names in the music industry performed there, like Lawrence Welk and Jimmy Dorsey and Duke Ellington and Harry James. Eventually, Harry King, in addition to having the ballroom, he built a park that had this roller coaster on it. It also had a swimming pool, also had a miniature golf course, and I've read that this was one of the largest roller coasters in the country at the time. I don't have any memories of the roller coaster or the miniature golf course, but I do vaguely remember the swimming pool, so they must have been around still in the late 60s. I don't know when they would have torn those down, but they must have been around in the late 60s yet. And the ballroom stayed very active for many years. By the time I was in high school, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Double K Drive-In in Norfolk, but Marv Konopasek, who owned Double K Drive-In, had bought the ballroom, and he had that was back in the 70s and that type of thing, when they had wedding dances, and the place was busy every weekend with wedding dances. So I worked for Marv Konopasek for 4 years during high school, and so on some weekends I would go out and work the concession stand at King's Ballroom. So if the walls at King's Ballroom could talk, they would have some amazing stories to tell. Unfortunately, in the, April 3rd of 1986, it burned down. So, but I've been told that, just learned recently that some of the artifacts from the ballroom have survived. Evidently, they were removed before the fire happened. Like in many ballrooms, when you walk into the entryway, it was filled. The walls were lined with photographs, black and white photographs of some of the entertainers who had performed there. And I think some of those pictures actually survive. So we're hoping maybe we can bring some of those back to Norfolk sometime. A little while ago, I mentioned Andy Risser and his influence on aviation in Norfolk. If you drive by the airport today, you won't find Andy's name on the front sign out front. You'll find Carl Stefan's name. Carl Stefan served in Congress from 1935 to 1951. Prior to that, he was a newspaperman and radio man, worked for the Norfolk Daily News and for WJAG Radio. If you talk to any of the old-timers, they can tell you stories about Carl's radio shows and how innovative and personable he was. And I think fairly influential in Congress. He's really was the reason we have the airport that we have today is because he was of his influence in getting federal funding for it. So that's why Carl died in 1951 while still in office, and they dedicated the airport to him in 1955. And I need to back up a little bit and talk a little bit about the importance of that airport during the winter of 1948 and 49. Some of you might remember the winter of 48 and 49, but that airport was used a lot to airlift hay to cattle, to drop food to people who were stranded out in the country, to bring people in from the country who needed medical care and so forth. So that was a very, very important airport because that blizzard, as you may know, really struck northeast and north central Nebraska the hardest. I don't know that southeast Nebraska got hit as hard as the north and central did. And it probably went as far as the Panhandle, but I think the brunt of it was really northeast and north central Nebraska, where it was. I have a great, my mom's cousin who's 90, and even my mom who's 87, can tell you stories about being stranded for days and days and days and days and days out in the country. So. I just quickly want to mention a couple other people. Diamond Dick, also a man by the name of Diamond Dick, who lived in Norfolk in the early 1800s, early 1900s, also known as Dr. Richard Tanner, had kind of two lives, was a Wild West showman with Buffalo Bill's Wild West Show, retired, went to medical school, and opened a medical practice in Norfolk. I'm not sure I would have gone to him, though, because he liked to create his own concoctions, one of which was called snow liniment, which included eggs, turpentine, and vinegar. For external use only, he warned. The mixture was a component in his vanishing face cream, which also includes almond lotion, glycerin, and talcum powder. And I don't know if that means your face actually vanishes or what, but I don't know if I want to try it. And then there's Thurl Ravenscroft. I don't know if anybody here knows who Thurl Ravenscroft was, but he was the voice of Tony the Tiger. So Tony the Tiger was actually from Norfolk. And Tony's been dead. Thurl's been dead for several years, but years ago when, again, the museum was trying to create an exhibit in his honor, I think one of our museum volunteers actually talked to him. I think he was in a nursing home or someplace, and they said that Tony could still growl. So. And of course that brings us to Norfolk's favorite son, Johnny Carson. I don't think there's anybody in the room who doesn't know that Johnny Carson lived in Norfolk for 10 years from 1933 until he graduated from high school in 1943. If you come to Norfolk, it probably wouldn't take you long to realize that we have some connection to Johnny Carson because we have Johnny Carson Theater, we have Johnny Carson Boulevard, we have the Carson Radiation Center. Johnny also donated to the Norfolk Arts Center, the Lifelong Learning Center. He's given money to the museum, the Norfolk Public Library, the Senior Citizen Center. He continues very generous to the Carson Radiation Center at Faith Regional Hospital, which is named for his parents. And even though he's been gone for 4 years, Johnny continues to contribute to Norfolk because I think through his foundation, I think just a few months ago the senior center got some money from his foundation to do some repairs to their building or that type of thing. So, and I will tell you this story really briefly. This is my only personal contact with Johnny Carson. About 7 years ago, I was vice president of the Elkhorn Valley Historical Society, and again, we're always trying to build exhibits. So I wrote Johnny a letter and said, we want to build an exhibit in your honor. Can you send us something that we can include in this exhibit? Because we really didn't have any personal items of his. And this would have been in August, like It would have been 8 years ago. And about a month later, he called me at work one day and said, well, he goes, "Hi, this is Johnny Carson in Malibu." And I said, "Oh, sure." No, I didn't say that, but I thought that. I thought, "Oh, sure, this is really Johnny Carson in Malibu." But anyway, after I figured out that it was, he said he was going to close his office in Malibu and he was going to send us everything. So he basically, that's what he did. He closed his offices and sent us all of his awards, all of his, we have his 6 Emmy Awards. We have his Presidential Medal of Freedom, the Kennedy Center Honors. We have framed magazine covers where he was on, that he was featured on the cover, awards and documents, and much of it is included in a permanent exhibit in his honor that's part of the Elkhorn Valley Museum. And much of it is actually just in storage. They bring it out once a year to either during the Great American Comedy Festival time or in October, which is when his birthday's in October. So there again, we owe Johnny a debt of gratitude for his generosity to Norfolk, because let's face it, he really did put Norfolk on the map. Anybody who's here who's watched his show knows that he mentioned Norfolk a lot. He would have people from Norfolk on the show, including his favorite teacher, Faye Gordon. And here's a little bit of trivia that nobody cares about, but I'll tell you anyway. Faye Gordon, Johnny and I had the same teacher. Faye Gordon was my freshman English teacher, and she was an interesting lady, to say the least. So now we're back where we started. This is a photograph of taken in 1929 at Hotel Norfolk, and those are the original German settlers who came in 1866 and settled Norfolk. So without those people, who knows where we would be today. And I do want to mention quickly, somebody asked me about how do you really pronounce the name, Norfolk or Norfolk? I don't know. I think everybody's heard this story, but maybe you haven't. When August Roche or whoever it was, the postmaster or prior to when they wanted to create the post office in Norfolk, you have to go through the government and establish the name of your community, I guess. And somebody wrote, because it was situated on the North Fork of the Elkhorn River, supposedly they wanted to name it North Fork, and somebody in Washington got a hold of it and said, "Oh, they must be Norfolk, like Norfolk, Virginia." So we became Norfolk. But if you talk to anybody, we call it Norfolk. We put that R in there, even though it's not really there. So that's the story behind our name. So anyway. So that's it. Thank you very much for listening to me. I would try to answer questions if you have any questions. Yeah?
There are 4 names I wondered if you're familiar with from
Okay.
Norfolk: Loisdale, Burge, Carlisle, and Bolts. They're all Norfolk people. Carlisle. Shoe store.
Yeah, the Carlisle brothers had the shoe store.
Yeah.
And
And also he flew with Andy and wrote 2 books about.
yeah, probably should have included him in here, because the one Carlisle brother was into aviation, the other Carlisle brother was into fireworks. Yeah, and I can never remember which is which.
Orville was the fireworks.
Okay, Orville.
Bob was the aviation.
Mhm.
And he wrote the 2 books. One of them was Andy to Tower or something
Yeah,
like that.
yeah.
I went to college with Bob.
Really?
He was engaged to my roommate, only they broke up, they never married.
Okay.
But they were engaged during the war. He was in the Naval Air Force.
Yeah, very involved in aviation. And then the firecracker guy was
That was Orville.
crazy.
He almost blew up Norfolk.
Yeah, he almost blew up Norfolk. He would, and Jim Carlisle, their son, his son is gone now. He died of cancer a few years ago. But he could tell some of the best stories about some of his dad's antics with fireworks. And I think he probably did practically blow up Norfolk a few times. But yet he was getting calls, and I don't know all the details. He was getting calls from people with the government who wanted him to help them with projects. And he really started Norfolk's big 4th of July celebration. He did it all on his own with his homemade fireworks on 4th of July, and it eventually, grew into what it is today. But yeah, they are, and I think in between time, they did sell a few shoes too, but I think they spent more time doing their other things, so, yeah, they're quite the characters, so.
They were.
Yeah, and Jim Carlisle could tell stories. He should be the one doing this program because he could tell stories like nobody I ever knew could tell stories.
And he was Orville's son?
Yeah, yeah, just neat family, neat family. Bob's wife, Laurenelle, is still,
Is she still around?
Still around.
I know Bob died.
yeah. And see, and Laurenelle's got kind of an interesting history because she was a nurse during World War II, served in the Philippines. So she's got kind of an interesting story herself, but yeah, neat family, so. Mm-hmm.
The cabin, the log cabin that was built, was that a one room?
Yeah, I think initially it was a one room. I think in time they built like a little, they may have had a loft in it, but it was, in time I think they built a lean-to type of thing onto it. And eventually I think it was actually sided, the logs were covered in more of like a clapboard type of siding. So, and in time that was all taken off and it was taken back to the original logs, so.
And then on the ballroom, interesting, a number of American flags hung. That was a photograph?
Yeah, and I don't know exactly what that occasion was. I don't know if those flags always were there or if they just put them, if it was some type of a military type of event and they just put those up for the occasion. I'm not sure what the story is behind that ballroom.
Yeah, gosh, I think I counted 4.
Yeah, yeah,
and big ones.
yeah. So it was a happening place for a lot of years, that's for sure. So.
I'll ask this.
Okay.
What lasting effect has the bank robbery had on the town?
I think for anybody who was there at that time, you'll always remember where you were that day. It was one of those kind of, it had that kind of impact on people. Because I was in the newspaper business, I was a little more involved than a lot of people because I don't know that it's had the impact. Well, I know for our business, after that happened, we started locking our back doors at the Daily News. So now you have to come in the back doors with a key. You can't, they used to just be open all the time. And there's probably a certain amount of that going on, where people are a little more cautious than they used to be. But I don't think it's, I think for the most part, most people have moved on. Of course, there's the families that were impacted the most that I'm sure they're still struggling with it, and they probably always will. But where the corner where the bank stood, the bank was torn down probably within a year after the shootings, and it's now been turned into a little park memorial type of area. I don't ever see a lot of people there. It's right on 13th Street, so you go by it a lot. You don't ever see really a lot of people in the park, but that doesn't mean that. I suppose it's one of those things too where every time you drive by it, you think about it. So, and I don't know if we're wise to do that kind of a thing, or remember when the Amish children were shot a few years ago?
They tore the school down.
They tore the school down and they dozed the ground and they planted grass over it, just so it wouldn't become a memorial.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know. How are we better to remember those or to handle those things? I don't know. So, but I don't think I don't think we're a town that's full of anger over it. I think we've realized that type of thing can happen anywhere to anybody. So, just try to move on. So, okay. Thank you very much.